All right, so my name's Julian Lepinski, and I'm actually at the University of Toronto now, the DGP lab, but this work was done with Professor Roel Vertigal at the Human Media Lab, where I was formerly, so that's a little subtext. And the work I'm talking about today is actually about designing with cloth as an interface, which is maybe a little heretical in a forum all about paper, so I hope everybody will forgive me for talking about cloth for 5 minutes, but I'm going to go real quick and try to just cover some of the stuff we did. So the question first is, why study cloth? Maybe we all agree upon paper, but I'll make the case for cloth really quickly. First off is that people are very familiar with cloth. It's something that pretty much everybody interacts with, and so there's sort of these basic properties of cloth that everybody knows about, and it's sort of a familiar substance. And then second, something that we thought was kind of interesting is that it can be very unobtrusive, and so it can act as sort of a disappearing interface to other objects, and so cloth can break over objects and things like that, and that's sort of something we tried to make sort of a cornerstone of the work we did. And so I'll talk a little bit about the design behind the work we did. We came up with some basic principles. First is that interaction should, whenever possible, flow from this cloth metaphor, and so people are interacting with cloth and they should interact with it like cloth as much as possible. Second is that input equals output, and so because we're trying to unify sort of the display and the interaction in one spot, that should be as unified as possible there. Third, form follows function, which is a little bit of a tongue twister, but this essentially means that the form of the cloth itself conveys a ton of information, and so the act of draping the cloth over an object sort of has all this inherent information in it, and that can lead us in a lot of interesting directions in terms of the function for the interface. And then finally, we decided to allow for physical or gestural interaction in our studies, and so that meant essentially both real manipulation of the cloth as well as sort of remote gestures near or above the cloth for some of the stuff we were doing. And out of these principles, we came up with this basic sort of set of cloth gestures. And so there's the stretch gesture. I'll sort of just explain each one as we go past really quickly, which is hopefully pretty self-explanatory. The squeeze gesture, which is the opposite of the stretch in that you take 2 points and you sort of move them closer together. The pinch, which I put right next to it because apparently this can be confusing, but this is sort of a one-handed squeezing a single spot on the cloth, and this can be sort of a real or a virtual gesture. The drape, which is our sort of intrinsic gesture where the cloth is placed over an object and there's information captured from that. The touch gesture, which is sort of a cheat because it grandfathers in tons of other stuff. The hover, which is a virtual gesture that we implemented. And then the pull and peel gesture, which is just sort of a pinch with a movement afterwards, which can also be virtual or real. And then what we did was we put together some applications where a cloth interface might be particularly useful, and I'm going to look at 2 of them really quickly. And so the first thing we looked at was in sort of the medical domain. There's a lot of cloth in a hospital. There's surgical drapes and there's patient gowns and things like that. And so we tried to think of places where having an interface on this cloth could be useful. And so before I show sort of a quick video clip, we looked at things like putting patient information on a patient as they travel around, and we also looked at moving digital information like fMRIs and x-rays and putting these in place. So whether as a learning tool or whether you're actually sort of showing underlying anatomy on a patient physically. And so this is sort of a quick demo of that, of this interactive anatomy that we worked on. And so what you're seeing here is the ability to sort of stretch the cloth from 2 points to zoom in and out. And then you're going to see a squeeze, which is the opposite of that, zoom back out. And then the next thing you're going to see is this sort of virtual peeling away of anatomy. And so you see for skin, which gets peeled away to show muscle and bone. And then you can peel this away again, and you can see sort of x-rays underneath. And this is just sort of demoed on a flat surface, but this is obviously also something we looked at putting on sort of drapes on top of the body. And then the second thing, this is like, I apologize for the fact that this is very uninspiring, but this is sort of a really common Canadian cereal box. And so the idea was that cloth, unlike paper, can be draped over objects and sort of can allow for a digital window into these objects. And so what we looked at was, again, a rectangular object is not the most fascinating one, but we looked at draping cloth over this to provide us a way to interact with the object. And so in this sort of simple demo, we're pulling up information on the ingredients, which is actually just 3, because this is a really old-fashioned Canadian cereal. And so you're just sort of paging through information about the object and interacting with it virtually. I think we're just about out of time, so really quickly, if anybody's interested in the way that this was prototyped, it was prototyped like a lot of this sort of stuff is prototyped by adding retro-reflective dots on cloth, and we used a relatively small number of dots, and then using stereo IR cameras and sort of inferring height from 2 images and then projecting. And then finally, we sort of built a mesh out of the dots we had to simulate the actual cloth surface, which allowed us to match up a lot closer with what was going on the surface, even though we had a relatively small number of dots. And so that's all the time I have. And obviously, anybody who wants to talk more about this, I'm around. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions, 1 or 2.